know you. Acting Director of KSAR this year. We're very happy to have you here, and especially happy to have Ken Seigneurie, who's here. He's a candidate for the position of the Edward Said Chair in KSAR. He is a professor and former director of the World Literature Program at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Some of you may know him because he's no stranger to Lebanon. He lived here many years before going. He researches modern Arabic, French, and British fiction, literary theory, and the history of humanist thought. I didn't bring his book, but it's available at Antoine Bookstore. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. He's written 5 articles since 2014 on Arabic literature and humanism in a world literature paradigm. So I'm happy to see world literature representatives here. And he's currently, well, he is the general editor of this massive project that's the 5-volume Wiley-Blackwell Companion to World Literature. So the book I was talking about, his monograph, Standing by the Ruins, Elegiac Humanism in Wartime and Post-War Lebanon, was named an outstanding academic title of 2012 by Choice Magazine. And he also has a publication recently in a book called What Makes a Man? Sex Talk in Beirut and Berlin. So this was the Awdat al-Amani.
Awdat al-Amani al-Rashdi. It's a translation of a short novel.
Okay. So please welcome Ken Seigneurie. The title of his talk is Toward Cross-Cultural Studies 2.0. Thank you.
You mind if I sit down?
It's a very small group, but
Yeah.
it's fine.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank, first of all, Amy Zenger and the search committee for this very warm and collegial welcome to the LAU. Good start.
That's because Lisa came.
That's it. That must leave it at it.
Can you know this is the house that I lived in for many years? Wow, looks a bit different.
Okay. Well,
Get territory.
I think the first thing I'd like to do is to change the title. The title was written in a bit of a hurry. The title of this talk is Permanent Departures and the Literature of the Nothing That Is There, with apologies to Wallace Stevens. Okay. I have a challenging task today. I want to identify a broad civilizational problem, the mere existence of which goes against contemporary convictions. Then, I want to propose a way to think about this problem, not to solve it, by attending to specific instances of an unpopular literary mode. The aim in this challenge is to begin training our eyes to read beyond therapy and beyond consciousness raising in order to appreciate differences and shared humanity. I've broken the paper down into sections. The first section is called The Problem. Humanism has always honed a polemical edge. From the 15th century rejection of Pope Innocent III's wretchedness of man thesis, Miseria Hominis, to Edward Said's late 20th century effort to adapt humanism to a multicultural world. To this day, the academic offspring of humanism remains central to modern academic practice and the liberal professions. Think, for example, of the philology of Lorenzo Valla, who exposed the forgery of the donation of Constantine, and whose work finds a worthy descendant in that of Sheldon Pollock. Think of the Studia Humanitatis and how it displaced the medieval trivium, and which remains today the soul of liberal education. And think of civic humanism, which is still the foundation of modern republicanism. On the other hand, humanist ontology, i.e. the understanding of what the human is and the human's place in the cosmos, has not fared so well. From the 15th century sense of mystery and awe at the center of human dignity in thinkers like Pico and Manetti, 17th and 18th century thinkers, from Descartes to Kant, placed the cogito, the fact of thinking, at the center of human nature. It was this man, the 17th century man, Mark Twain's self-important thinking animal, that Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud dismembered. And in the 20th century, desperate efforts at rebuilding a cogito-centered humanism foundered in a series of melodramatic deaths of the author for Barthes, of man for Foucault, of the subject for Lacan. Even a more modestly construed unity of man humanism could not withstand Lévi-Strauss's anthropological critique that exposed generic man as a universalized particular that happened to be white, male, Euro-North American, upper middle class. So well known is the narrative by now that two recent influential books, Stefanos Geroulanos' An Atheism That Is Not Humanism Emerges in French Thought from 2010, and Mark Greff's Age of the Crisis of Man from 2015, imply embarrassment that humanism could have been taken seriously at some point. Does it matter that the humanism excoriated today is demonstrably not the same as that which emerged in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries? Indeed, why should we care about an ivory tower argument that goes back to the late Middle Ages? Here's why. The refutation of humanist ontology means that humanistic practices at the center of academic, professional, and political practices today, i.e. critical reading, humanistic education, and republicanism, are arguably imploding over a humanism-shaped sinkhole. Big claim. Indulge me one example. As worldwide economic integration has accelerated in the past 30-odd years, North American humanists, understandably enough, have come to see their job as trying to understand and deal with cultural change, as humanists always have, by critically reading, educating tolerance, and respecting otherness. At the same time, the communities these humanists serve see the same cultural changes, shifting demography, new cultural influences, to name just two, and draw the not illogical conclusion that their identity is slipping away. They look to the humanists, who at one time might have invoked cogito-based humanism to support European exceptionalism, or earlier still, the white man's burden. But while we rejoice that those days are gone, today's humanists have no answer to the question of human identity, and can only point to the absence at the center of the problem of human identity. Nor have anti-humanism, transhumanism, or post-humanism as yet provided a compelling vision of the human's place in the world. Instead, with no alternative at hand, humanists have had to concede that social identities are primary, which contradicts human ontology. Yet they affirm all the more strongly the foundationless humanist values of tolerance and practices of critical thinking, humanistic education, and republicanism. For the communities they serve, that are seeking an answer to the question of tolerance in the name of what? Lectures on tolerance do not answer the question, and indeed seem paternalistic and dismissive. So while we humanists seem to have little difficulty with not being able to answer the question of who we are and what it means to say we in the first place, for the communities we serve, these questions are fundamental. Feeling their identity crumbling in a globalizing world, they react by shoring up obsolete, nationalist, racist, and sectarian identity formations. Humanists, seeing the rise of reactionary impulses, respond, surprise, surprise, by calling for ever more bridges to otherness, ever more tolerance, which predictably enough stokes identitarianism, and so the vicious circle turns. The more one side bridges, the more the other side walls, largely because the absence at the heart of what it means to be human in a post-humanist world remains unanswered. But you knew that already. The national identity crisis in Lebanon in the early 1970s prefigured post-Cold War identity crises throughout the world. In the absence of consensus on what it meant to be Lebanese at the time, some plunged into reactionary identity formations, others into brave new worldism. It too was a vicious circle, and we know how that worked out. The next section is called How Not to Think About the Problem. As humanists, it's tempting to double down on openness and inclusiveness as values in and of themselves, and to forget or ignore that we have no idea why we cling to them, other than that tolerance is less confrontational than agonism. That's the path of progressive politics without a vision, tactical alliances, and strategic essentialisms, all of which undermine progressivism's own ethical framework and lead to weakness and failure. Indeed, while these humanists tie one hand behind their back out of tolerance and promote, somewhat cynically it must be said, their own identitarian agenda with the other, the unabashed identitarians have no such compunction and win on these terms. So instead of playing identitarianism half-heartedly with full-blooded identitarians, we could try taking seriously the basic concerns of the communities we serve and work toward forming a consensual vision of what it means to be human today. The task is enormous and the obstacles formidable. For decades, extremist and populist ideologies have been filling the vacuum left by foundationless humanist practice. And if the solution were clear, it would have emerged by now. So let's not propose another humanism. I say this having proposed one myself a few years back. Instead, in a spirit of humility, let's explore methods, not in the aim of solving the problem of post-foundationalism, but of simply learning to address the problem. After all, it was changes in the methods of reading and education, conditioned by contacts with the Abbasid Islamicate, that led the early modern Europeans to the humanist consensus around dignity. Given my role in a world literature program, one might think that this would be the place to put in a plug for the methods of world literature. Yet that would be a mistake. That would be to mistake the potential contribution of world literature for its reality. World literature, at its best, opens the aperture of literary study without devalorizing other, more focused approaches, such as post-colonial studies, ethnic or national studies. Regarding literature as a cross-cultural practice that is both global and unequal, as world literature does, is fine. But it stops short of posing the question of what world literature means. By contrast, national literature, as Benedict Anderson persuasively demonstrated, is of, I quote, central ideological and political importance, end quote, in forging a nation. Whatever else can be said about national literature, and there is much, let us not forget, it forged a link between literary practice and an affective commitment to the nation. world literature has nothing comparable. Consider Goethe's famous remark about it in 1828, quoted approvingly to this day in every issue of the journal World Literature Today. Quoting Goethe, "The aim is simply that they, nations, shall grow aware of one another, understand one another, and even when they may not be able to love, may at least tolerate one another," end quote. Tolerate one another sums up quite nicely the affective emptiness at the heart of not only world literature, but of the humanities that we see today. This emptiness cannot endure. Without an animating vision, world literature, like digitization, the technology that grew almost in tandem with this recent wave of world literature, and with which it has many similarities, will fall prey to a ruthless leveling. Just as the internet makes no distinction between holy texts and propaganda, world literature can include in the same breath the Buddha Carita and the Da Vinci Code. Both travel, both are translated, both vector cultural capital. Nor, however, does leveling imply a neutral mean, but again, like digitization, a universalized particular that some call Americanization. I prefer the term universal modern, which in the realm of literature means a privileging of Western texts and practices, no matter who writes them, and Western reading practices, no matter where they're learned. Thirdly, just as digital text encourages what one scholar calls frenetic reading, as we jump from one screen to another, according to individual whim, world literature too can lack direction and militate against the kind of rigorous, focused reading that permits one to grasp specificities of otherness. Next section is called Toward Thinking About the Problem by Considering Death. So, while world literature's current embrace of mere tolerance and its juxtaposition of otherness is a symptom of the problem of humanism, I hope to show that it can be part of the way forward. As a rule, I abhor back-to-origins solutions for complex problems. But I do think it is useful, not as a solution, but as a sensible practice, to at least consider what was so compelling about 15th century humanist ontology. The idea of the uncircumscribed human at the center of human dignity at that time was not construed as a positive feature of human beings, unlike later the cogito was viewed as the distinguishing feature of humanity. Instead, the early humanists reveled in the sheer potentiality of what it meant to be human, whether this was spelled out, as in Pico and Manetti, or celebrated, as in Boccaccio, Chaucer, Rabelais. I'd like to suggest that such catholicity of vision points the way today to ways of reading literature that might eventually themselves lead to a methodological integrity that may someday evolve into a vision of what it means to be human. In the meantime, it's good, honest work. So let's see if literature can tell us anything about permanent departures, death mostly, that other fields can't. In other words, let's not claim something for literature that sociology, psychology, or trauma studies, to name just 3 disciplines that focus on death, can do better. These fields specialize in treating pathological conditions that follow permanent departures. The rationale underlying a principle of their practice is that if traumatic feelings are left untreated, then repressed and unassimilated memories of pain and trauma fester and break out in the form of pain, mental illness, and violence. In the 1990s, trauma studies experts such as Bessel van der Kolk and Onno van der Hart concluded in a Freudian vein that, I quote, "Overwhelming experiences need to be integrated within existing mental schemes and be transformed into narrative language, end quote. Once narrativized, trauma may then find a cathartic release, freeing individuals and societies from pathology. The paradigm, summed up in the phrase, revealing is healing, remains central to truth and reconciliation commissions the world over, and has some successes to its credit. For all its efficacy, however, the trauma studies model leaves much undone. The Freudian assumption that each single traumatic memory must be, quote, brought up and hypercathected in order for the libido to eventually displace to a new object likens memories to the antigen and antibody model of biology. And this seems too optimistic, too clean. Surely it's not too pessimistic to suppose that the psyche would harbor an inaccessible supplement of grief and pain even after treatment? Or again, the idea that traumatic memories may be expressed in language and then integrated into a liberating narrative seems overly optimistic about the capacity of language to capture experience. It is more than plausible that language will leave an inaccessible supplement of grief, and that any cathartic release will always be partial. So, we can accept the therapeutic model for the good it does, yet we recognize that after all the therapeutic narrativization, all the socially responsible ethical claims, the dumb fact remains that pain that cannot be cured must be endured. What can literature do about this remnant of pain? Let's look at two rather different traditions, taking care not to artificially polarize them, yet while remaining alert to their specificities. Next section is called Permanent Departures in English Language Elegies. The interesting thing about Jahan Ramazani's magisterial 1994 study of the 20th century elegy in English is his observation that it veers into, I quote, the anti-elegiac, becoming anti-consolatory, anti-encomiastic, anti-romantic, and anti-Victorian, anti-conventional, and sometimes even anti-literary, end quote. He notes, again quoting, the modern elegy resembles not so much a suture as an open wound, end quote, consciously invoking Freud's trope for melancholia, and again, a pathological condition. It departs from the traditional elegy in even more fundamental ways. While anger can be a part of the elegiac, in the modern elegy in English, it can deflect hostility inward. Think of Thomas Hardy and Wilfred Owen, who express uneasiness at profiting artistically from death. It can project hostility outward, attacking and debasing the dead. Think of elegies by Lowell, Plath, Berriman, Ginsberg, Sexton, and Gwendolyn Brooks. And it can refuse to, I quote, indulge the onanistic work of mourning, end quote. Think here of Geoffrey Hill. Reading Ramazani, one is struck by the palpable rejection of what early 20th century critics called the feminized 19th century practices associated with sentimental sadness, that's a quote, and sorrow. I kind of wonder how you interpret this. For me, I think Ramazani is identifying a refusal to register pain within the very poetic mode designed to express it. Instead, the rage and hostility suggest a revolt against something that should not be. An injustice has been inflicted. Nor is Ramazani alone in seeing this. Clifton Spargo's excellent 2004 book on elegy is called The Ethics of Mourning. The introduction to Diana Fuss's 2013 book, Dying Modern, notes, I quote, the ethical burdens of poetic elegy have apparently only increased in the modern period. She stresses, again quoting, in a very real sense, ethics is elegy, end quote. Indeed, one has a hard time finding a study of elegy in English over the past 3 decades that does not deal with the ethical. Such ethical elegies do not, as a rule, point to cosmic injustice, but to something that could have or should have been done in the here and now to prevent death. To this extent, they are political, social, and psychological critiques. To a large extent, the 20th century ethical elegy is entirely warranted and understandable. After all, industrialized mass deaths in 2 world wars overwhelmed the singularity of traditional elegy. State-sponsored deaths, genocides, and natural disaster deaths, not to mention the commodification of death in the funeral business, have all done much to push the pathos of elegy toward ethical judgment. As a result, however, the ethical elegy doesn't deal with death so much as with a society, a person, or a force that could have prevented untimely death, but didn't. The ontological fact of death, astonishingly, often goes without saying. Why? Perhaps because Enlightenment Prometheanism continues to promote the notion that human society possesses an unlimited capacity to change the world, and what cannot be changed, i.e. death, is akin to gravity, a condition to be lived with. The early modern humanists had no such confidence, even though they came away from a 14th century that was even more death-ridden than the 20th. For them, the human being was an uncircumscribable mystery, not an enlightened consciousness that can right the wrongs of the world. The next section is called the elegiac elsewhere and otherwise. We now turn to instances of the elegiac mode which cure nothing, forestall nothing, and do not even offer a palliative to the pain of permanent departures. And here I think it's not a bad idea to recall the modest mission I mentioned above, to explore consciousness where it is and not where we want it to be. And we do this by hewing closely to what literature does, as opposed to identifying where it stands on an implicit scale of values. In her study of classical Arabic elegy, Marthiyah, Marley Hammond argues persuasively for the thematic and structural similarity between the elegy and the amatory prelude, or nasib, of the ode or qasida. For our purposes, the important thing here is that elegy and love poetry spring from the same root in Arabic, which stands in stark contrast to the modern ethical elegy in English. My interests, however, are not in the elegy so much as in the elegiac mode in Arabic across genres. Where to begin? Well, let's start in the basement nightclub right here in Beirut and work our way up from there. My wife and I used to go to the Caravanserai, just on the other side of Hamra, where we would listen and sing along to one song after another with titles like Qaryat al-Finjan, Laylat Hub, Balash Tabusni fi Arniya, Al-Atlal, Bukto Ismak, etc., etc. Now, while these songs do not necessarily fit the traditional form of the elegiac ode or Marthiyah, their thematic preoccupation with longing for that which is forever gone, lost love, lost friends, lost childhood, lost home, make them honorable representatives of the elegiac mode. A particular kind of longing, nostalgia, is a feeling modernists often associate with reactionary politics and a surrender to fate. Yet it is deeply rooted in most literatures of the world. Not only is longing acceptable, it is the object of aesthetic intensification. In Arabic, hanin, like nostalgia, refers to longing, yearning, hankering. But as Wen Chin Uyang remarks, it, quote, goes beyond individual psychology, quote, end quote, and self-absorption. Thus, Whereas nostalgia in English has come to imply a sentimentalized, self-indulgent response to the past, Hanin can also evoke shared feelings, including, and here I quote Ouyang again, tenderness, sympathy, compassion, and commiseration, end quote. Hanin, like its cognate, Hanan, also implies a social relation of affection with others that goes beyond the monad and easily transcends identity with the tribe or the nation. Any and all humans are subject to Hanin. Kulthum's 1967 version of El Atlal, The Ruins, is an hour-long embrace of the personal anguish of loss in its fullness, focusing it into a refined, astringent pleasure, shared in fellowship with others who presumably feel likewise. Over the course of the song, it unfurls the tight progression of time, ungluing cause and effect, and even ethical responsibility in a lyrical intensification of ever-present longing. The listener gives the self over to the very feelings of pain and longing that are elsewhere pathologized or deflected into socially constructive activities. And it is done not out of weakness, but rather out of a breathtaking, courageous choice to lay oneself open to the pathos of longing, to englobe in a gesture of acceptance a cosmos that could cause such pain does not imply a personal cure or compensation for loss. If anything, it intensifies sensitivity and vulnerability to pain. So, if longing is, in this sense, is not curative, palliative, or progressive, and if it's not, as I affirm here, a mere exercise in ineffectual self-indulgence, then what value could the elegiac possibly represent? In its admission of vulnerability, longing is the most anti-heroic, anti-enlightenment of feelings. In its emphasis on tenderness, sympathy, and compassion and commiseration, longing is fundamentally affective and social. In its universality, longing is transcendent. For its vulnerability, longing will never win a conflict. For its intensification of suffering, it will never be progressive. And for its universality, it will never be wholly reduced to one identity or another, although many will affirm that it can be. Yet for all these reasons, longing and the literature that inflames it is deeply and irredeemably human. The next section is called The Elegiac and Rehumanization. So important is the role of elegiac longing that it is often subtly but strongly thematized in literature. Take the justifiably well-known 2008 novel by Mustafa Khalifa, El Qawqa' Yawmiyat Mutalassis, The Shell, Diary of a Voyeur. A young middle-class atheist filmmaker of a Christian family longs to return to his unnamed Arab homeland after 6 years of study in Paris. Why? We never know. It is a pre-rational longing, as he has everything he wants in Paris. Yet he bids farewell to France and his fiancée. But as soon as the plane lands in his homeland, you guessed it, he is arrested, tortured, and imprisoned without charge for 13 years. In prison, he endures mistreatment the authorities mete out to all inmates, but the author, Mustafa Khalifa, apparently wants to sharpen the protagonist's alienation by making him an atheist Christian on top of it, which makes this character also the object of attacks from the Muslim extremist majority in the prison. And he therefore lives ostracized in a community cell of some 24 inmates. The novel recounts the narrator's unlearning curve as he unlearns one human right after another and eventually unlearns to speak. During one exercise period, when the forced ingestion of small rodents is the least disgusting of tortures, he muses, "I ask myself sometimes, What creature am I? A man? An animal? A thing? End quote. All translations are mine. His humanity stripped away, the narrator's sanity buckles. Indeed, in response to ongoing torture and coercion, the prisoners respond in three, sometimes overlapping ways. Most double down on their extremism, such that one might plausibly speculate that the author, who spent 15 years in Syria's notorious Tadmor prison in the 1980s and 90s, gives us a glimpse into the school that trained the ISIS generation. A second response consists of those who go raving mad. And the third response includes those like the narrator who withdraw into silence and only appear mad. The barometer of the narrator's loss and recovery of humanity is sexuality and its related feeling of longing. And here again we go back to the idea of longing and the elegiac being linked to love poetry. The unlearning curve is remarkable for the narrator's lack of longing throughout. He does not long for Paris, his fiancée, or his previous life. Likewise, his sexuality atrophies. Upon his first witnessing of torture, the narrator remarks, "I felt a shiver between my legs." And when he is stripped search, a guard observes, "Oh, this thing is small." And the narrator looks down and remarks to himself, "Yes, it really was tiny. Even it was terrified and despairing. It had retracted into its sack." As the narrator's humanity retracts, so does his sexuality under the guard's insults and torture. Indeed, the narrator wonders why the guard's idea of the worst humiliation imaginable always has to do with the sexuality of the women in the inmates' lives. It's always whore wife, or if I'm quoting, or if the prisoner's not married, whore sister, or whore mother, whore daughter. I ask myself, is it just a pastime, or is there a method? A studied method to crush and humiliate the human being via the woman, considering that women are the highest value for Muslim men, be she a wife, sister, mother, or any close relative? End quote. Clearly, love and longing are the nexus of vulnerability. So if dehumanization goes in parallel with the pollution of loving relationships, rehumanization, when it comes, unfolds with an affirmation of sexuality and reemergence of memory and longing. Sexual affirmation is at first furtive. A third of the way into the narrator recounts his sexual fantasies with women he had known as a means of keeping from going mad. At the same time, he elegizes for the first time those who have died in prison, even going back in his mind to those whose death he witnessed previously, but failed to mourn for at the time. Here we again are reminded of Margaret Hammond's identification of the link between the elegiac and love poetry. The fulcrum of the novel comes some 10 years into the narrator's incarceration, when his cellmates partially lift the ban on contact with him to allow one who is considered only half mad to approach him, and the two become fast friends. Love becomes his means of rehumanization. His relationship with Nassim is all-consuming and fulfilling, but not long-lasting. Without a hint beforehand, the authorities pluck the narrator out of prison in the middle of the night, and he cannot even say farewell to his friend. At this point, in sharp contrast to the emotionalist style at the beginning of his narrative, the narrator indulges in elegiac expressions of longing for his friend. He is put into a series of holding cells where the authorities use every means, from torture to cajolery, to get the narrator to sign a telegram of thanks to the president for his clemency in exchange for his freedom. The narrator admits that he would have signed in blood hundreds of telegrams earlier in his prison career, but now he refuses. It is as if his friendship and all that it includes in terms of love and longing has strengthened him. Indeed, in keeping with the link between sexuality and humanity, he affirms that the years in prison have taught him el-karama wal-rujula, dignity and virility. At the end of the novel, his friend is released from prison under a general amnesty, and the narrator sets out to visit him, only to see Nassim commit suicide in front of him. After this, the narrator retracts into an even more impermeable shell than that of his prison life. He attends the 40-day commemoration of his friend's death, then goes to bed and sees Nassim in an elegiac vision. Nassim appeared. He stood erect before me at the edge of the bed, without speaking, without moving. The word for erect in Arabic, intasaba, is suggestive of erection, and again, longing and sexuality are connected. He continues, Nassim, quote, only looked at me with the gaze I saw in his eyes a few minutes before he committed suicide. I understood the look, a murderous rebuke, and an expression, why did you leave me, why did you leave me, as if I heard the Christ at the moment of his death shout a rebuke, a plea, confused with deep love, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, end quote. A paroxysm of elegiac mourning follows. The narrator rushing out in the middle of the night to buy flowers and weeping for his lost friend until morning. The shell, therefore, this novel, therefore thematizes elegiac longing as synonymous with sacrificial love and full humanity. Far from the cliché of self-indulgence, the text underscores the orientation of longing to the loved one, not the self, and it connects it to the process of rehumanization. Okay? Now, ideally, I would have, at this point, put in a novel from North America dealing with love, longing, the elegiac, and there are plenty to be had. I didn't have enough time. What I've given you is my current research, not what I would have put together for this talk if I'd known, say, 2 months ago. The next section is called Where Would I Find Elegy Like This? The title of the play, Qala Izay Fain Ya Ali, Where Would I Find Someone Like You, Ali, is taken from a song made famous by the Lebanese singer Sabah. Written by Ra'ida Taha, directed by Lina Abyad, the play focuses on the topic of the family of Ali Taha, a political martyr and father of Ra'ida Taha, a well-known stage actress in the Middle East. It explores Ali Taha's May 1972 airplane hijacking in which Israeli commandos, including one Ehud Barak and one Benjamin Netanyahu, stormed the plane and shot dead Taha and a comrade. Their bodies were kept in a refrigerated Israeli morgue. I'm hoping some of you have seen this play, right? You have, haven't you? So something familiar about this, right? Where Would I Find Someone Like You, Ali takes place in the present with Ra'ida Taha playing herself in a one-woman show, recounting the aftermath of her father's martyrdom when she was 7 years old up to the present. Her account begins when, as a 25-year-old secretary, she opens the door of her apartment to one of her boss's colleagues, who bursts in, pins her down, and gets up only after she screams for the neighbors. He flees before physically raping her and tells her boss, who happens to be Yasser Arafat himself. And he secures her safety henceforth. But the traumatic event triggers a psychological torment. She curses her dead father, the great martyr, whose absence made her vulnerable to such humiliation. Far from expressing elegiac longing, Ra'ida expresses hate for her father for not being around to punch the highly respected man and would-be rapist. To this extent, the play shares the hostility of some of the English language elegies. I'm thinking of Sylvia Plath's Daddy, for example. But this is only the beginning of the play. The near rape is only one event in Ra'ida's lifelong struggle to come to terms with the memory of her father. In a flashback to the immediate aftermath of Ali Taha's death, we see in a series of aborted elegiac moments the priority of the Palestinian cause over the family's dignity. First, Ali Taha's last will and testament is addressed not to his family, but to his fellow Fada'iyin, and is oriented toward the promotion of the cause. Only a short passage at the end of the testament refers almost as an afterthought to those left behind. The other thing we charge you with is to take care of the families of the martyrs. Second, condolences following Ali's death avoid elegiac longing in favor of celebrating his heroism. At one point, Yasser Arafat directs his attention to the daughters, asking each what she wants to do when she grows up. "I want to be an astronaut," says one, and everyone is flushed with pride at the progressivism of the girls, until Arafat gets to the 4-year-old, who affirms in the innocence of infantile elegy, "I want my dad." There follows a series of similarly inadequate or aborted elegiac moments. A friend of the family visits to pay his condolences. He praises Ali Taha's courage, and then offers to have his driver take the children out for ice cream, until Fatiha, Raida's mother, shoots back, "Oh no you don't, get out you bastard," knowing well the man's lascivious intentions. Another aborted elegiac moment. As martyrs proliferate, one widow invites Fatiha to join her to visit another recently widowed woman. Not to commiserate, but to, quote, "see who looks better in black," end quote. And after they arrive, the woman realizes that the newly widowed woman is wealthy. So she urges Fatiha, quote, "Why all the weeping? If Georgina sells that table leg, she'll be set for a year," end quote. Then, just when it seems that cynicism is all the world of the play can know, 2 years after Ali Taha's death, the family goes to Jerusalem. And there, Raida sees her father's sister, Suhaila, who has made it her life's mission to recover her brother's body from the refrigerated Israeli morgue, where it had been kept since his death. While illiterate herself, Suhaila has enlisted the aid of others to write dozens of letters to dignitaries and politicians in order to recover her brother's body and bury it properly. Suhaila learns that Henry Kissinger is in Jerusalem, so she pushes elbows, literally and figuratively, through a palisade of mediators to get to the U.S. Secretary of State. On the way, an acquaintance of the family counsels her gravely that what she proposes is men's work. And Suhaila snaps, "So where are the men?" and slams the car door on her way to Kissinger. Finally getting closer, she approaches a couple of American military attachés who tell her Kissinger doesn't meet with Arabs. She pushes past them to someone she buttonholes into listening. And just then, she sees Kissinger himself leave a nearby room. And she calls, "Hey, ya Kissinger! Hey, you Kissinger!" and gets close enough to deliver the elegiac lines around which the entire play turns. "Listen, my brother is a martyr, and they've put him in a refrigerator for the past 2 years. Honoring the dead means burying them. Each human being has the right to bury and be buried. I wrote you 2 letters, and you did not respond, and here's my 3rd. Take it. This is inhuman. I want my brother and not the answer to a letter. Come on, young woman, translate. Don't be shy." Unquote. Unlike his literary equivalent Tiresias, Kissinger is able to persuade the Israeli Creon that this Antigone is serious about burying her brother. And when the body is finally delivered and celebrants crowd around hooting and hollering, Suhaila calmly orders them to open the coffin, at which point she takes out a sharp knife and in a businesslike way cuts through the shroud to make sure her brother's face is there. And she verifies his identity, and only then does she let out an ululation and recite elegiac poetry. The play demonstrates that Suhaila's devotion and sacrifice in recovering the body equals her brother's devotion and sacrifice to the cause of Palestinian political rights. Her commitment to the elegiac, indeed, arguably surpasses Ali Taha's commitment in that it is pure devotion, which can yield no real-world payoff. Over and over, the elegiac has no payoff. The family is thus raised from the realm of an afterthought to equals with the Fedayeen. Understanding this equality and dignity, Raida acquires the strength and pride that comes from sharing the meaning of her father's life. So the aborted and perverted elegies end. And Raida describes how each member of the family lives in elegiac memory of Alitaha. What I like most about this play is that its two moments in history, the early 1970s and the present, are separated principally by their attitudes toward the elegiac. What was taken utterly for granted in the 1970s, a family's dignity in sorrow, has 40 years later supplanted the previous highest priority, i.e. the political cause. This is not to deny or diminish the validity of the Palestinian cause or Ali Taha's role in it, but to recognize that just as sometimes pain is in places that are treatable, as in truth and reconciliation situations, and sometimes pain is in places that are amenable to progressive consciousness raising, as in the question of Palestine, at other times pain is elsewhere. And maybe the elegiac is the best way of not dealing with it, but living it. So in conclusion, we have not solved the broad civilizational problem of the absence at the heart of contemporary humanistic practice. And we have not offered a way to read the elegiac that sweeps away other ways of dealing with permanent departures. I told you we wouldn't. I do hope, however, that we have attended to some significant details within the elegiac that allow us to discern and appreciate differences while encouraging us to recognize shared humanity. Thank you.
Open the floor to questions, discussion.
I have a question.
Contemplation.
I do have a question for John Malloy, a medievalist. I'm not a medievalist, I'm a modernist. I dip into the medieval when I can, as much as I can. But if you don't want to embarrass me now, later on you might want to tell me if my reading of this 14th, 15th century humanist moment is in some way valid or defensible.
Well, I think I'm part of the medieval world that can't really give you a very accurate assessment of your reading. Yeah, I mean, it sounds good to me, quite frankly, but you know, as a kind of person who does social economic history,
Okay.
you know, I'm kind of looking through lots of lenses that are substantially different from the ones that you are.
Okay.
But based on my experience teaching, you know, these CS type core courses, it's pretty wonderful.
Okay. Thanks.
Other questions?
Well, if you were to pick something from, from the United States, off the top of your head, or what might resonate? I recently not only saw the play, but read the play, and I love what you're talking about in terms of the stereoscopic structure in that, emotion has this one meaning at one period, as does political commitment. And it's one of the most interesting aspects of the play is, what it means later on. But is there, I know there's nothing analogous, but is there something that sort of comes to mind that's at least kind of illuminates slightly, this question in American literature?
I mean, the first text that comes to mind, and you probably already predicted this, is Absalom, As I Lay Dying, which is the whole thing is death and elegy. More recently, Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad being death, is probably the first thing that comes to mind. But there are plenty of others. I mean, there was also David Egger's first book, what he calls it? The
Heartbreaking work of
That's
Incredible Genius.
yeah. Not a book that I like all that much, but I mean, it comes to mind as one example as well. So yeah, that's why I go with it initially. I think with a bit more thought, there's there's an Asian American writer, whose name slips my mind, who also deals with this elegiac mode. And when I read her novel, I remember thinking, oh, this would fit. This is elegiac in spades. Her name will come to me.
Thanks a lot.
And nice to see you again.
Great.
I'm very sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, so excuse me if my question, if you mentioned that. I was wondering, are you interested in a comparative approach to the elegiac as regards, in particular, Western American literature, or is it more a global kind of perspective? I mean, now you mentioned an Asian American author. Are you also interested in other kind of cross-cultural
This is a really good question. I mean, in my 2011 book dealt with the elegiac, and at that point I wanted to demonstrate that I could look at a limited corpus and do it as well as possible, and it worked out all right. For this book, I want to stay with the elegiac, but I definitely want to broaden the scope. Hence, I've been reading these books such as the Ramazani's and others on the elegy in English, and obviously I would go into French as well. I'm a little bit reluctant to go into traditions for which I don't possess the language. It's people are doing it more and more, but and I don't think it would be all that hard, but I'm kind of reluctant to put myself on the firing line of dealing with something a language that I don't master, at least adequately. So to answer your question, definitely Arab world, the Anglophone world, including North America, and the Francophone world. And so that, of course, that takes in quite a bit, because we're talking about Francophone and Anglophone. So, yeah. But it isn't, can you think of anybody who writes on elegy or the elegiac? I mean, I don't know of anybody who does. I mean, I mentioned a few people I do know. It's a very unpopular mode, the elegiac. So, I kind of like that, though. It kind of gives me a sense that I want to change things.
Has Mustafa Khalil written other things aside from his novel?
Not to my knowledge. Mustafa Khalifa. He's Syrian. He now lives in the Gulf, and I contacted him to translate the book. I loved it when I read it, and I thought, somebody has to translate this. Not easy to get a hold of. He writes only in Arabic, and me writing in Arabic is laughable exercise. But I did, and he responded, and he was interested, but it kind of broke down at the contract level. It's not that I was looking for money, but I was looking for guarantees that he would take my translation and not at some point take somebody else's translation and tell me, sorry, but no thanks. Because that does happen. And I think it was a language problem. I was trying to express this, and I think he understood that I was grasping or something like that. But no, I don't think he's written anything since then. I've tried to find as much as I could about him. I think his novel is just phenomenal. I'd recommend it to anybody.
And what was the date of it? I don't know if you mentioned.
2007, it's 2007, so it's before, 2011 and all that, and, but I do think it's a glimpse into the, primary school of ISIS.
Yeah.
Anyway, I genuinely regret not having a text from North American text in this talk, but I thought to myself, I'm not going to botch it by doing something that's, I can pull something together in a week after class, that kind of thing, but I don't think it would have worked. It certainly would have been open to more criticism.
Could you say some more about the beginning part of your lecture,
Uh-huh.
which you framed,
Yeah.
where you ended up within the discourse on humanism,
Yes.
changing discourse on humanism? I found that incredibly interesting.
Well, thank you, because that's the most controversial part of the whole talk. Humanism today, I mean, as I say, it's been thrown off the boat, as it were. I accept the post-structuralist critique of humanism with an asterisk. The humanism that they are criticizing is an Enlightenment humanism whereby the human being is defined as the thinking animal. And that humanism, I think, has been definitively and, for all time, buried. It has kind of given us a vision of the human being that, as I say, at one point, universalizes the particular of the Euro-North American male. And that was rhetorically a very powerful move in marginalizing others throughout the modern period. But my interest in humanism is that we do the same kind of patient genealogical work with the humanism of the 15th century. That humanism, which to my reading is a humanism that is, first of all, a cross-cultural product of the Arab world and Europe. And when we say Arab world at that time, the Abbasids, we're talking about Jews and Christians, the Syriacs, Muslims. So it's quite not to mention that in Europe there were a number of different sources as well. So what is that humanism? That humanism, as far as I can tell, it defines the human being not in positive terms, but in the terms of the uncircumscribed mystery at the heart of what it means to be human. And that is where this idea of dignity comes from. And you can see it spelled out in Pico and in Manetti, but you see it deployed in these writers who have this kind of wild imagination, the Chaucer and the Boccaccio and the Rabelais. They're not following a pattern. They're exulting in the sheer polyvalence of what it means to be human. And I kind of like that. I mean, and dignity comes from that. Why? Because if you can't define the human, it's the thinking animal. It's the image of God. Okay? If you can't define it, the idea is you respect it. There's something almost sacred about it. Indeed sacred about it. So it's now, I have more research to do on this. Not that I've done a good deal so far, but I'm always, ready to be schooled on that.
When Edward Said spoke very close to the end of his
Yes.
life at this university,
Yeah.
his talk was about humanism as a binding force.
Is about
Humanism as a binding force.
yes. I was at San Ferris Hall. I was there. Yeah, well, we all were. I mean, that was what the place was packed. But yes, but from my reading of Democracy and Humanism, what was it? Humanism and Democratic Criticism, was that the title of the book? Yeah. He doesn't defend that thesis of humanism. He assumes it. And the fellow at the University of Binghamton, what's his name? Friend of Edward Said. He wrote a book called The Legacy of Edward Said. William Spanos, wrote a book in which he basically said, dear Edward, I love you like a brother, but your humanism shtick doesn't wash. And I think Spanos took him to task in a rather facile way there, because Said didn't do that, groundwork. He took it for granted. In my reading of that book. Okay. Yeah.
I have one question actually. When you mentioned, that came to my mind when you mentioned the idea of the definition
Yes.
of humanism. And I mean, coming from the other side of the literature, of this critical tradition, I mean, very often what we reflect on, in that context, is the idea that definitions, they belong to the definers.
Yes.
In other words, I mean, they are mediated by certain vectors of power and access to voice that not everyone can have, and also that, I mean, very often reflect the biases of those who define. So, I mean, then how can we reconcile this kind of, I don't want to say fact, but at least historically verifiable way of basically looking at the process of defining with what you're proposing?
Yeah, I like that question. It reminds me of Susan Stafford Friedman's book, Planetary Modernism, where she is trying to define modernity and modernism. And in the end, she says, these nominal definitions whereby we have characteristics, positive characteristics to define something, doesn't wash. And so she proposes a relational definition. So that modernity isn't a system or a list of characteristics, but rather modernity is defined in relation to what is not. In my case, when I'm talking about the definition of the human as being uncircumscribable, I'm kind of taking a page out of, not taking a page, I'm actually understanding that problem of nominal definitions that you just mentioned, and you stated very eloquently, that it is a problem. But at some point we have to think and use language. I've chosen to define the human in this early modern humanism as uncircumscribable to try to avoid that problem. Okay. I shouldn't say that. I'm actually reading the texts. The texts say that. But the only other way of responding would be to, I think, follow Stanford Friedman's lead and do a kind of relational definition. In other words, the human is this at this point in history, and it's compelling, and then it shifts at another, and then another, and another. I'm not all that, I mean, I kind of find that a bit too contingent. I mean, then the definition of the human becomes pretty much the problem that I'm trying to avoid, and that is when we admit the problem of definitions, and then so therefore we throw up our hands and say, okay, so it's all a question of power, and my definition will be what I'll use, and yours will be what you use. I want to try to avoid that. I think that's the problem that we're in right now, is this kind of, inability to offer compelling, I'm not even saying clear, just saying compelling responses to what it means to be. I think people need this. We were talking earlier, Seren and I had a great conversation, and I fess up. I mean, I want values in literature. I want value. And that doesn't, that is a problem for a lot of people. So be it. I would rather have that than to cede the terrain to this identitarian scrum whereby the most powerful or the most brash end up, taking all the marbles, as it were. Yeah.
I think another way of approaching that in literature, I'm not a literary scholar, but I read a lot, is through the way that writers allow different characters to use language in different ways, whilst at the same time allowing common denominators of what their humanity is to come through. The book I'm thinking about, which I read quite recently, is A Brief History of 7 Killings, which is written by a Jamaican writer and is about life in the slums of Kingston. And the writer, whose name I've forgotten, you're not alone, the writer writes his different characters in different degrees of patois, so that the character is coming through in their relationship to English language or to Jamaican patois, and it's on a sort of a social scale and a scale of age or education, intelligence, circumstance. It comes through in many different ways.
I really like that. Then you say you're not a literary scholar.
No.
In my own modest way, I was trying to pull together that kind of careful reading of significant detail in the text to show how the elegiac emerges and how it emerges. What is this elegiac like? How does this elegiac differ from that one? To talk about difference, because difference exists. If we deny difference, we end up in that, kind of homogenized vision of literature. I really like that use of different levels of patois to convey empirically the kind of variations.
It's quite hard to read, and it's very, very worthwhile.
Yeah, I like that.
But it sounds a lot like Rabelais and His World by Bakhtin. It's immediately what it evokes, so it's very interesting sort of connection.
Yeah. So this is about Bob Marley.
Okay.
When you brought up the difference between nostalgia and longing, when I think of nostalgia in terms of literature, the first group of people that come to mind are either the Soviet or post-Soviet writers. So what I'm thinking is, and bringing again Edward Said's example, is when you're looking at works written by authors living in the diaspora, and you're looking at either that longing or nostalgia in terms of the post-socialist writers versus the hateful ranting that might come up. So when you brought up Khalifa, he reminded me of Seigneurie and Voices from the Chorus, which he wrote about his experiences in the Gulag, but he was writing it in Paris. So I'm really wondering how much that longing versus nostalgia is actually coming through. Like, can you actually glean the differences between nostalgia and longing?
I don't think there are. I think nostalgia is a subset of longing. It is a kind of longing. Longing can be broader than that, but nostalgia, this is the way I read it. And I actually have a great deal of respect for those who have studied nostalgia. I'm thinking in particular of Svetlana Boym. Her distinction between restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia. It's a little bit arbitrary. It's kind of like making these two categories kind of, well, this is the way I like it. This is the way I would want it to be, so I'll make these two categories. Nevertheless, it's provocative. Restorative nostalgia is that kind of reactionary nostalgia where you want to bring back, this honor, for example. Reflective nostalgia stops at the level of longing and doesn't act. It's reflective. It's pure emotion. And so, yeah, I mean, I would opt for the latter rather than the former. But Seigneurie, I love this. The reason I exclaimed when you mentioned the Soviet writers, and I think they do great stuff. I've taught a couple of texts, and I find myself wanting to pick up Russian again, a language that I studied at one point. But if there were world enough and time.
Maybe just what you said, when you mentioned the translation, I actually looked up if there is a translation, and it came out just December 2016. Mustafa Khalife in English translation.
Oh!
Paul Starkey translated him.
Really?
I just looked it up. And on Amazon, he's marketed Mustafa Khalife as a Syrian Solzhenitsyn. So that speaks to what you just said. And it's, the political prison and torture in Syria is very much modeled, certainly, after the East European, especially actually East Germany, but also the Russian kind of model. So there is, Akit, a lot of, similar experience.
Wow, and he got a good translator. Paul does a
Paul
good
Starkey
job.
is amazing.
Yeah, does a real good job.
So I just looked it up when you mentioned it, so I found it, and now that it's interesting because he's kind of, it says, I don't know, in the book cover, but in the Amazon little thing, it says, he's a Syrian Solzhenitsyn. So.
They translate it as the shell?
The shell, yes. I forgot.
Oh, good, I can teach it.
I just looked it up, so the publisher is down. Slow internet.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for coming. Hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for